Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to talk about a group of armies that we don't usually talk about very much on this channel. I have what I call the major powers, so that's Britain, France, Prussia, Russia, Austria and Spain. You could tie in there as well. But there were a lot more forces than that took part in the Napoleonic Wars. So today, I just wanted to talk about some of the smaller nations that took part and why I think they're a really interesting idea, both to collect for the person new to Napoleonic Wargaming and for those who have already got an army or two and are just looking for something a little bit different. So first off, what do I mean by the minor powers? Well, Napoleon, one of the big things that he created was the Confederation of the Rhine. So that's the first place for me to start. And that would include the armies of places like Westphalia or Württemberg or Nassau, places like that. And also larger nations as well. Sort of proper countries, if you will. So Bavaria or Portugal would probably come under these two as well as perhaps Italy. Obviously one of my favourites, Poland, or the Grand Duchy of Warsaw as it was known. So these are the smaller powers. I guess you could also include the more peripheral states in this as well. So now I'm thinking things like the Ottomans, the Greeks, the Greek War of Independence, that was a bit later. The United States, things like that, basically. India, of course. So not necessarily minor in size or in organisation or history or anything like that, but just minor in the impacts they had on the Napoleonic Wars. So there's really two ways of going about collecting troops from one of the minor nations, and that's to either go for the entire army. So, instead of saying, well, I'm going to collect a French army or I'm going to collect a Russian army or whatever, you say, well, I'm going to collect a Westphalian army or I'm going to collect a Portuguese army. And that's great. We'll get into why that's particularly good in a bit. The second reason, and the one that I'm going to sort of focus on first, is just to add some units into your existing army. Now, the absolute perfect one for doing this is the British Army, particularly in the Peninsula, although in Waterloo as well. Now, the reason why I say in the Peninsula particularly is a British division consisted of 3 brigades. This is certainly by 1812 anyway. It consisted of 3 brigades, 2 British ones and a Portuguese one. So, if you've got your British troops, a brigade, you're looking around about 3 or 4 battalions. So if you've got a decent sized British army, you've probably got 2 brigades of British, and then you can add that third one, that Portuguese. Now the Portuguese, of course, they wore those dark blue and white uniforms, so they're quite nice, something a little bit different. And it just lets you add those extra units to your army. Now the French, they had a lot of foreign units in their army, particularly in 1812 when they invaded Russia, but not just then. And sometimes they had completely separate corps. So the Ninth Corps were Bavarians, things like that. But occasionally as well, particularly earlier on in the period, they would mix their troops, their foreign troops, for want of a better term, into their normal divisions. So anyone who's been following the series on the Swiss will know that they were fighting alongside usually French reservists or perhaps sometimes even locally raised troops. But then I've also recently finished the Portuguese Legion. So they were troops that wore Portuguese uniforms, although they were brown in this case, and they fought for the French. They fought in the 1809 campaign. Anyone who's been watching the live streams will know about the Spanish division under La Romana that fought for the French up in Denmark. Which reminds me, those are some armies that I also should have included in the minor nations. Nations such as Denmark, Sweden, Holland to an extent. Yes. So you've got these small foreign formations, and as I say foreign as in not native to the main force, that fought alongside them, sometimes integrated into their larger units. Now this is really, really good because it means that you don't have to commit to doing 6 different battalions from a different nation. You can just do that one if you want. So for argument's sake, you've got your French army and you fancy doing a Portuguese unit. So you buy a box of Portuguese, jobs are good. They also had a Prussian regiment, or you could even do things like the Croats or even the Vistula Legion. Just troops like that. The Swiss, obviously. Just, you've painted yourself 5 battalions in French blue. You want something different. That's when you bust out the red and paint some Swiss. So it is doable to do it that way as well. And I would suggest probably preferable. The reason being that if you've got your main army, you've got your opponents at the club or locally or whatever, and it just means that you get a break, and it means that you can do something a little bit different before cracking on with those French infantry again, or that British line, or whatever it happens to be. Now, it's a little bit more problematic for the Russians and the Austrians, as they tended not to use that many auxiliaries, I guess you could say. So you'd have to be a little bit more creative with those. I guess the Cossacks you could maybe suggest they're certainly irregulars for the Russians. The Austrians, I guess Grenzer would probably be their least line troops, but still, yeah, they're still part of the same army. But for those armies, you could even look later on in the period, so 1814, and we'll be coming back to that later, 1813, 1814, where the Austrians and the Russians often fought side by side, and they often fought with something that we'll also get into in a bit, the minor German states. So you can always, have it as a 1813 or 1814 era army, and you can have that battalion of Bavarians in there. You can have that battalion of let me think of someone else who flipped, the Württembergers, something like that, and it just stops the painting getting stale and allows you a bit more experimentation, because I would imagine that a large number of Napoleonic gamers are into it for the spectacle of the uniforms. That's one of the things they like. And while there's something to be said for having a massive dark blue infantry or the thin red line, it is cool when you've got those other troops mixed in. Now, of course, speaking of the thin red line, the British at Waterloo are another spectacular example of this. They used basically the same organisation that they had in the Peninsula, but instead of a Portuguese brigade, it would be a Hanoverian brigade or perhaps a Dutch-Belgian brigade, depending on which one it was. Now, the Hanoverians, not really that much different to the British, but the Dutch-Belgians, they allow you to paint something different. And, of course, Nassau, they fought for the British in the Waterloo campaign. So there's another example there. And I would suggest that Nassau are probably one of the more popular minor nations for people to have if they're doing the 1815 campaign. So I mentioned earlier on about Bavaria, and I mentioned that they flipped. So what I mean by that is they actually start off incredibly enthusiastically pro-French, but as the 1812, the Russian campaign happened, Napoleon was defeated, he retreated back, and the writing was on the wall pretty much for the French Empire, the French First Empire. Then these nations that before had been, as I say, either sort of very keen to follow them, or perhaps a little less keen, like Prussia, they turned against Napoleon and they started fighting with the Allies. And that means that if you've got one of those minor nation armies, if you've got those Bavarians or something like that, then you can always fight the French and have a historical justification for that. Now, one thing that I would say is that even if you've got an army that didn't flip, so if you've got a Duchy of Warsaw army or an Italian one or something like that, who cares? You can still fight the French anyway. It is a game after all. How many times have you seen World War II games where it's been the British versus the Americans, or Germans versus Germans, or whatever? So you can still have those battles, of course you can. But if you're someone who's interested more in the historical side of it, these German nations, these minor states, they give you a chance to fight against both sides. Now, looking further afield, we mentioned the Ottomans and the Indians. Now, they definitely fought both sides. The Ottomans, of course, they fought against the French when the French invaded. They also fought against the Russians. They fought against the British during the Abercrombie expedition. So, Ottomans, they fought other Ottomans. They fought the Persians. I think they're called the Khaji, Qajr, something like that, I'm not really sure. They fought the Wahhabists. The Ottomans fight everyone. The Indians, depends which way you go down. We're going to focus a little bit more on Indians later on in the year, on the Indian Wars, I guess you could say. Not the American Indian Wars, the Indian in India Wars. And you've got the East India Company armies there. John Company, you've got them fighting the the Mahajaratas. I'm definitely going to have to learn how to pronounce that properly before we do the focus on them. You've got Indian sepoys, you've got British sepoys. I'm fairly certain somewhere I've got a battalion of Bombay sepoys. I don't know what the hell I've done with them, but they'll be somewhere. But so they can fight both sides as well. You can obviously fight civil wars in India as well. So could they fight the Ottomans? Why not? I guess they could. So you've got plenty of opportunity there as well. So these minor nations, they often were either forced to join one side or the other, or they saw which way the wind was blowing and they decided to change because it would be in their best interest. Somewhere like Bavaria did that really well. I mean, they ended up being quite a large kingdom right up until the unification of Prussia. So they did excellently well, whereas places like Saxony and places like that, they didn't do quite so well at that. Saxony is another good example as well, actually. So anyway, sorry, I'm beginning to ramble a little bit there. The basic point is that these minor nations often fought for the French and against the French. Particularly later on in the war, they would often flip. Sometimes early in the wars, they would fight against the French as well. So I just mentioned the Saxons. Really good example. In 1806, the Saxons sided with Prussia, perhaps not that voluntarily, and they fought against the French. They got an absolute whooping along with the Prussians. And then by 1812, they were one of the most popular, they were one of the most supportive minor nations of the French. And then by 1814, they were fighting on the Allied side. So that's a really good example, actually, of how the Saxons can fight pretty much on both sides. And you can always get a historically accurate opponent if that's something that's important in your Napoleonic hobby. Now, the next point I want to make about these minor nations is they are achievable from a collecting standpoint. Now, what I mean by that is, if you've got a small army, so take the Bavarians, for instance, they sent 8 regiments into Russia, so 16 battalions, plus some light troops, plus some cavalry. I think 3 regiments of cavalry, I believe. Could be wrong on that one. I think it's around about 3. So that is an achievable goal. You can collect 16 battalions of infantry, 3 regiments of cavalry, and I believe 2 batteries of guns. That is achievable. I'm not saying that you're going to be able to do it over a weekend, but if you're like me, you're someone who's a bit of a completionist, then you're never going to collect the entire French army. I hate to say this, but you're never going to get the whole French army. Not in 28mm anyway. You might be able to get it in 6mm. Definitely not in 28mm. I wouldn't even fancy it in 6mm either, to be fair. But these smaller nations, you certainly can. So a good example of that is the 8 battalions of Swiss. That's really cool. You could do the 4 regiments, each of 2 battalions. You could get all the Swiss. Now, they didn't necessarily fight together in the same formation, so something like the Vistula Legion might be a good idea. Those of you who started watching, or who saw my series where I started the Vistula Legion, it has stalled, unfortunately. I've been wooed away by other projects, but it's still there, and it's still possible for me to get it finished. I'm 5 battalions in. I've only got 3 left. I need to do the 2 regiments of Lancers, and then that's pretty much it. So that's an achievable goal as well. The flip side of that, of course, is the nations that you're never going to be able to. So again, something like the Ottomans. I mean, you can collect 120 regiments of Janissaries if you want, but that's a lot of Janissaries. And if you get them all from the assault group, I think you would need to sell your kidneys, probably 3 kidneys, in order to afford all those. So it is possible, but very unlikely. But you've also got the smaller nations who you've got everything. You've got a small nation that has to combine with another one to raise a single battalion of troops, to the ones with the full armies. Now, a current project of mine is something that I'm getting quite excited about. These guys will be ready for the channel at some point, hopefully this year, probably not till later on in the year, but this is the army of Württemberg. Now, one of the reasons I really like the Württembergers is they've got line battalions, they've got Jaegers, they've got light battalions, and they've got a good selection of cavalry. They've got Garde du Corps, they've got Dragoons, they've got Hussars, they've got a really, really good mix. Well, they're not Hussars, they're Jaeger, they're mounted Jaegers. So they've got a good range of models there, and it's collecting that small army you could actually collect the entire thing. As I said about the Bavarians earlier on, you probably could get those guys as well. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to, or even that it's a sensible idea, but if you're someone like me, you enjoy having that full selection, then collecting one of the minor states is something that you can really go for. I actually think the full field army for the British is actually quite achievable, but that is a very, very long-term goal, that one. These minor states, you can do it much shorter. So that's it, really. I just wanted to put some ideas out there. I want to make one point that brings both of these approaches together, either painting up the odd unit to go into your existing army, which you can then, once you've done 2 or 3 of those, you've got yourself a brigade, do 2 or 3 more, you've got yourself 2 brigades, a cheeky unit of cavalry. Again, Saxon's great for that, because they were at the Battle of Borodino. A cheeky regiment of cavalry or 2, and suddenly you've got that army, a good-sized army ready to go. So the things that why I want to draw together the 1 battalion at a time, or that's become your army thing, is the uniforms as well. Now, a lot of people really enjoy the in-depth research of the uniforms and the organisation and the tactics and all that stuff. That's fantastic. The smaller nations, they can be quite difficult to find resources for sometimes, but once you have, then that can be really rewarding. You can get these really out there uniforms, and they just look fantastic. Well, I was going to go to Hammerhead this year, which is one of the Wargaming shows in Newark, but unfortunately I couldn't make it. But while I was there, I was going to pick up a battalion of Saxons, because I realised that they wore their 1806 uniform, which I think is super cool. They wore it all the way up to 1812, so including the Danube campaign. So there's a bit of utility there, rather than just having them for that one campaign where they got absolutely curb stomped. And so these interesting uniforms, they stand out on the tabletop. They stand out in your collection. One thing that I thought about doing this video on was a review of the troops. I'm looking at reviewing my Russians. I'll be doing that later on. But it was certainly when you're reviewing the troops, or you've got them on the tabletop, that regiment or that battalion that's in white coats in your blue-coated army, or that's in green in your red-coated army, they really stand out and they really draw the eye. And that's what draws people in to having a look at your game. And, having a look at your figures, and, this is something that we want. We want people to see the time, the effort that we've put into our models, because that's why we've put the time and effort into them. Ultimately, we like to show off the models. I don't mean that in a bad way. That's why we like 28mm, or, if you like 50mm or 6mm, it's probably because you like the massed look of the units. But even that has its charm as well. When you've got that one battalion that looks slightly different to everyone else, maybe they've got different hats or just different coloured uniforms, things like that, or even that they're in column while everyone else is in line, something like that. So that's the joys of collecting some of the minor powers. What are the downsides? Well, the biggest downside is that they can be quite difficult to get hold of, or you may be limited for manufacturers. Now, I think this is becoming less and less of a problem as time goes on, particularly as 3D printing comes along. Now, I must confess, I had absolutely no real idea about the army of Württemberg. I certainly wasn't that interested in collecting them, but since Piano Miniatures did their phenomenal Kickstarters, I've now got all the files for that, and I'm busily bashing away making an army of those. So that's certainly one thing, is that the manufacturers' lines are becoming larger and larger. The Perrys, of course, they do Swedes, Danes for the 1808 campaign, I think, 1807, 1808, up in Copenhagen and up there. And of course, a lot of the older manufacturers, people like Old Glory, or maybe Elite Miniatures, Connoisseur, Foundry, these older stalwarts of the hobby, they'll do ranges for these as well, I'm sure. The other option as well, and I'm supposed to be summing up here, but I keep thinking of extra bonuses for why, is you also get that conversion possibility as well. If you've seen the Maxi Minis video I did on making Westphalian, Spanish, and Württemberg cavalry out of the French heavy cavalry, you can certainly Maxi Minis using the conversions from the plastics as well. Now, one thing that it can be a problem is that they obviously don't have their own inherent plastics, but that's fine. You can either convert your own, or just accept that this is going to be a bit of a side project, and it's going to take longer to build up because it's going to be more expensive. And that, for me, is why I would probably go with I'm going to collect the British, but I'm going to slip in the odd Portuguese battalion now and again. Of course, they've got plastic models, actually. But I'm going to collect the French, and I'm going to slip in the odd Duchy of Warsaw unit from time to time, things like that. So that would be my recommendation. That's how I'd go. Start building them up as auxiliaries to your main force, and then get them on the tabletop. One of the things I really like about Black Powder is that they have a distinct identity to their parent nation's troops. So the Bavarians, for instance, they lack initiative. The Poles, they have tough fighter, things like that. So just things that make them a little bit different. But that's it for today. I just wanted to talk about the joys. We often talk about on this channel the major powers. I've done deep dives into a lot of them. We look at how to play them, how to collect them, all that stuff. So I just wanted, in this episode, just to shine a light on some of the minor powers. The slideshow that you've seen on this one has been some of their uniforms. I've mentioned before about Berg Lancers. I don't know a huge amount about Berg, I'll be absolutely honest, but I'm going to get a regiment of their Lancers because they look cool. So that's it really. It is, for me, one of those rule of cool things. It allows you just to do something a little bit out there, a little bit different than your normal painting. And when you've got to the bottom of that 15th box of Frenchmen that you've had piled up for the last year, at least you can treat yourself and paint something that's a little bit different and break out those pinks or those green paints to make a nice change. Well, that's it. Thank you for listening. Let me know in the comments what your favourite minor nations are, and if you have, or if you're planning on collecting a battalion or a regiment from those, stick it in the comments. Let's have this as a bit of a back and forth. As I say, my Württembergers are coming along pretty slowly at the moment, actually. I seem to have been distracted by painting other stuff. Epic Brits regiment, I've just finished those, or battalion of those, I should say. And that's about it, really. I've not really had a huge excuse. I've not done a massive amount of painting recently. I'm doing my Spanish, of course, on the live stream, so join me for those. If you've not, that's every Wednesday from 6. That's the moment we're in 6 British summertime, so whatever time that is in your local time zone. And I hope to see you guys then. But that is it for today. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.